This is the second part of a presentation on the new approach to stroke recovery in Boroondara. But this presentation looks at the need to develop a comprehensive and coherent information management strategy that can support the information needs of stroke survivors and carers and support the operation of the Stroke Recovery Education Centres. But this information management strategy can also, if necessary, support the information needs of stroke support groups and the information needs of the Stroke Association of Victoria. So let's see how this can be done. Perhaps the most important requirements of this information management strategy are that it must be efficient, effective, and adaptable. It must support the widely varying and constantly evolving stroke-related information needs of survivors and carers in all metropolitan, regional, and rural communities, whether or not they are comfortable using modern computing devices and technologies. It must make maximum use of all existing and reliable sources of stroke-related information. It must support all forms of stroke information storage and delivery, including conventional books, e-books, websites, fact sheets, video and audio podcasts, as well as hard copy documents. It must support the conduct of regular quality of life or well-being surveys of survivors and carers. It must be able to link stroke-related information to topics of interest to survivors and carers, and specific answers to survey questions. It must be able to link answers to specific questions to specific clinical or non-clinical actions. It must make maximum use of web-based technologies while supporting traditional information management technologies. It must make extensive use of tablet and smartphone devices. It must support the training of survivors and carers in the use of tablet devices. And it must support the flow of information between stroke industry players in support of well-defined interfaces and business processes. In this slide, I have identified 8 different categories or kinds of stroke-related information that may be needed by stroke survivors and carers and which need to be managed by this strategy. These categories are defined based on the scope and the sources of that information. They include personal information that is relevant only to an individual stroke survivor and members of his or her medical and peer support teams. For example, a survivor's personal details, their stroke event history, and the names and contact details of members of their peer support and medical support teams. Then there is local information that is relevant to all stroke survivors and carers who are members of a local stroke support group. This would include information regarding stroke support group meetings, contacts, and activities. This could be the website or a link to the website of the local stroke support group. But it might also include links to websites describing key services offered by local council agencies and service providers. Then there is regional information that is relevant to all stroke survivors and carers who are clients of a local stroke recovery education centre. This might include information regarding education programs, mentor training programs, and contacts for the local stroke recovery education centre, if there is one. But it might also include links to a broader range of services offered by local council agencies, service providers, and community organisations. The combination of local and regional information would effectively become the Stroke Services Guide for the local community or region, which could be made available in online or print versions. Then there is state information that is relevant to all stroke survivors and carers living anywhere in Victoria. This could be the website or a link to the website of SAV. It might include links to information regarding SAV contacts and services, and statewide services provided by organisations like Carers Victoria or state government agencies. This information would be collected and maintained by relevant state-based organisations, but be wrapped up in contextual information for stroke survivors and carers. Then there'd be national information that is relevant to all stroke survivors and carers living anywhere in Australia. This would include links to the website of National Stroke Foundation or links to specific NSF contacts and services. It would also include links to Australia-wide services provided by federal government agencies. This information would be collected and maintained by relevant national organisations, but would also be wrapped up in contextual information for Australian stroke survivors and carers. Next comes global information that is relevant to all stroke survivors and carers living in any country. For example, links to information regarding stroke in general that has been published by recognised international stroke organisations, universities and research institutions, like the risk factors of stroke and possible stroke-related disabilities and conditions. As before, this global information would be collected and maintained by relevant organisations and would also be wrapped up in contextual information for stroke survivors and carers. Next would be stroke recovery stories written by stroke survivors and or their carers. This would include all sorts of written, visual or oral stories created by stroke survivors and carers about their own stroke recovery experiences. These stories will be cross-referenced by stroke-related topics that enable stroke survivors and carers to find stories that are relevant to them. Eventually, this could become a global repository of the lived experience of stroke survivors and carers. Next comes lifestyle information that is relevant to anyone regardless of where they live or what chronic condition they have. This would include links to all sorts of information about healthy lifestyles that are of interest to people with any chronic condition, including stroke-related chronic conditions. This information would need to be sourced from reputable organisations, not just fad marketing organisations. This method of classification of stroke information clearly illustrates the inadequacies of traditional methods of organising and accessing information, either as fact sheets, books, or on the internet. For example, stroke-related information is stored in hundreds, if not thousands, of different websites, and it is a daunting task, even with the aid of search engines like Google, to locate information that may be required at a particular point in time in a particular community. This task is even more difficult for stroke survivors and carers who may not be comfortable with internet-based technologies. So we need a much better way of helping survivors and carers to find the information they need when they need it. The suggested solution to that problem is to create a personal website for each stroke survivor who elects to access this facility. This is a unique place or portal where a survivor may go to access all the personal information, the local information, the regional information, the state information, the national information, the global information, the stroke stories, and the lifestyle information that is relevant to them. All this stroke-related information can be sourced from reliable sources and linked into appropriate personal websites. But even that does not ensure that everyone can find the stroke-related information they need at the time they need it. So this slide illustrates how the stroke-related information can be linked to the specific interests of individual stroke survivors and carers. This is done through the construction of topic hierarchies, where high-level stroke-related topics such as stroke prevention and stroke risk factors can be broken down into lower-level topics such as stroke and smoking, blood cholesterol, and high blood pressure. We then classify stroke-related information or documents based on their scope, for example as local, regional, state, or national, as described in the previous slide. For example, there may be documents with titles like Smoking in Public in Camberwell or Smoking in Public in Boroondara or Blood Cholesterol Testing Stations in Victoria or Blood Cholesterol for Dummies. These documents may be of many different types, as shown here. We then create what I am calling document topic links, which indicate which documents refer in some way to a topic defined in one of these topic hierarchies. This means that a stroke survivor or carer can quickly locate any documents from any source that relate to a specific topic of interest or concern to them at that point in time. And the way those linkages are constructed, only documents relevant to their particular scopes will be returned. A similar arrangement can be used to link answers to survey questions to relevant documents. These surveys may be traditional clinical surveys, like the HADS survey, or specially designed quality of life surveys, which assess the survivor or carer's level of concern for various stroke-related deficits. Surveys are defined to contain one or more questions. For example, What is the dominant feeling you have when you think about your post-stroke life? Each question may have one or more answers. For example, I am very angry that I had a stroke, or I am very anxious about my future, or I feel depressed about my future. Again, we see the document database from the last slide, where we can classify stroke-related documents based on their scope, i.e. as local, regional, state or national. For example, there may be documents relating to an anger management course offered by the U3A in Hawthorne, or a website published by the DHS titled Anxiety Support in Victoria, or an NSF fact sheet titled Stroke and Anxiety. We can then create what I'm calling document answer links, which indicate which documents are relevant to a specific answer to a specific survey question. Obviously, we will need significant assistance from health professionals to establish these linkages. But this means that a stroke survivor or carer can complete a survey and receive a list of documents that are relevant in some way to all the answers they gave to those questions. And again, those linkages may be only to documents that are relevant to their particular scopes. A similar arrangement can be used to link answers to survey questions to specific clinical or non-clinical actions. As before, surveys are defined to contain one or more questions, and each question may have one or more answers. But here we can define a set of actions that we may want to initiate automatically when a specific answer is given to a particular question. For example, we may define the following possible actions: refer survivor, send a notification, conduct a test, or make an appointment. We can then create what I am calling answer action links, which indicate which actions are to be initiated whenever a specific answer to a specific survey question is given. Obviously, once again, we will need significant assistance from health professionals to make these linkages. This means that a stroke survivor or carer can complete a survey and one or more actions will be automatically triggered based on the answers they gave to those questions. The information management strategy should also facilitate the efficient and effective flow of information between different stroke organisations within what we may call the stroke recovery industry. This slide indicates how this might work for, say, an SREC and the SAV. Let's assume we have a business process that involves SAV and SREC staff, as indicated by the two white circles and the double-headed arrow. What we would do is to assign two logical email addresses to either end of this arrow. So one would be associated with the SREC end of the process and the other with the SAV end of the process. Let's now assume that as part of the performance of this process, SREC staff send a document, let's call it document 1, to SAV staff, who then send another document, say document 2, back to the SREC staff. These document transfers are illustrated here, and they would use stock standard email services to achieve the transfers. This strategy could be applied to the majority of document transfers between SAV, various SRECs, various stroke support groups, and their strategic partners. All that would be needed is some discipline in negotiating how these boundary crossing business processes were to be conducted. This slide contains a very high-level view of the way all business organisations should operate, and in particular how it is suggested that stroke organisations should try to operate in the future. It is very much a stakeholder-focused management model. So we see here a stroke organisation, be it the SAV, a stroke recovery education centre, or a stroke support group, and a list of potential stakeholder categories who may have an interest in that stroke organisation. Each of these stakeholder categories may contain individual people, groups of individuals, organisations, or groups of organisations who share a common interest as service providers, service users, or strategic partners of the stroke organisation. So the first thing the stroke organisation needs to be able to do is to develop formal or informal strategic processes which collect strategic information from individuals and organisations in some or all of these stakeholder categories. This strategic information may relate to the unsatisfied needs of members of these various stakeholder groups, or the willingness and capacity of stakeholders to work with the stroke organisation to satisfy some of those unsatisfied needs. This strategic information is consolidated into strategic plans relating to each of these stakeholder categories. The next thing the stroke organisation needs to be able to do is to develop planning processes that translate these strategic plans into operating plans, policies and targets relating to the needs of members of each of these stakeholder categories. Following that, the stroke organisation needs to be able to efficiently and effectively perform these stakeholder-oriented operational processes. This involves the exchange of operational information with members of the various stakeholder categories and the generation of information in the form of operational results and performance measurements. Finally, the stroke organisation needs to perform control processes that compare those operating plans, policies and targets with operational results and performance measurements, and to generate operating summaries which are fed back into the relevant strategic processes and planning processes. While it may not be necessary to implement this idealised management process in existing organisations such as stroke support groups or the SAV, this model provides a blueprint for the establishment of new stroke organisations such as stroke recovery education centres. This is particularly the case as much of the initial planning work can be automated based on clear definition of what categories of stroke organisations are potential service providers, service users, or strategic partners of the new SREC. This model also identifies important categories of information flows between different categories of business processes, and this can feed into the design of efficient information flows described in the previous slide. In this slide, we return to look at the 8 different categories of stroke-related information. We need to appreciate that this stroke-related information may be generated or used by a wide variety of individuals and organisations involved in the stroke industry, including stroke survivors and their carers. And that information may be stored in documents that have many different forms. So in designing and developing the information management strategy to support the efficient and effective operation of SRECs and associated stroke organisations, we need to keep these factors firmly in mind. It will simply not be good enough to build yet another silo of stroke information which has traditionally been done by stroke organisations and the vast majority of business organisations in the past. The focus of this information management strategy must be on the needs of the stakeholders in the stroke industry, not on any particular organisation in the stroke industry. So, how could all this work? Well, it is essential that for the new information management strategy to support the operation of SRECs and other stroke organisations, that it be based on a highly flexible database that can store all sorts of stroke information, but particularly pointers to existing documents that contain credible stroke information that has been generated by many stroke organisations and stored in websites on the World Wide Web over the past 20 years or so. Access to this database and the stroke information it contains must be provided by 2 distinct mechanisms, namely a stroke industry stakeholder registration process and a general access process. These processes will be outlined in this and the next slide. The stroke industry stakeholder registration process will create a login page through which access to stroke information stored in this database may be obtained. There will be a stakeholder registration page that gives individual people or representatives of stroke industry organisations authorisation to log into this database. But the stakeholder registration page will require applicants to specify what role or roles they wish to play when accessing the database. This is vital because these roles determine what sorts of things they can do and hence what parts of the database they can access while they are logged into the database. So, someone who is registered as a stroke survivor will be granted access to their own unique homepage, which allows them to perform a specific set of functions. These will include functions that give them access to their own personal stroke information held in the database, but to nobody else's personal stroke information. Someone who is registered as a member of a particular stroke survivor's peer support team will be granted access to a home page which allows them to perform a set of functions that are specific to their responsibilities as a peer support team member. If a particular person is a member of the peer support teams of 2 or more stroke survivors, they will be able to perform the designated set of functions for each of these survivors. Similarly, someone who is registered as a member of a particular stroke survivor's medical support team will be granted access to a home page which allows them to perform a set of functions that are specific to their responsibilities as a medical support team member. And finally, someone who is registered as an administrator of the database, or as any of the roles specified in the previous slide, will be granted access to a home page which allows them to perform a set of functions that are specific to their responsibilities. The general public access process will not require registration or login authorization, but will of course provide access to a completely different set of functions. These will exclude any sort of access to any of the personal stroke information stored in the database. The primary purpose of this access method is to provide people with access to stroke-related information for the 7 non-personal categories of information stored in the database. This will primarily be done through access to stroke topic hierarchies described earlier. These hierarchies provide links to the vast number of stroke-related documents that may be found on the individual websites of stroke organisations around the world. Another way of looking at how access to stroke information will be provided is to consider the 3 different access points or methods that will be provided, namely for registered SREC stakeholders who play an active role in the operation of an SREC, members of the general public who require access to information about stroke, and members of stroke support groups or stroke associations such as the SAV. Here we see those 3 access points and the shared stroke information we described in the previous slides. Each of these access methods will have their own unique homepage with a unique URL. In the case of stroke support groups or stroke associations, they will have their own unique homepages, just as many stroke organisations currently do. There is no need to change an existing URL. Now let's look at each of these access methods in turn. In the case of registered SREC users, or those people who wish to become registered SREC users, the SREC login page will give people the opportunity to register as individuals or representatives of particular organisations, or just as people with an interest in stroke and the work of an SREC. During the registration process, People will be required to nominate the SREC role they intend to play. These SREC roles were listed in an earlier slide. They will also nominate their email address and will be allocated an authorization code for each SREC role they wish to play. This email address and authorization code can then be entered into the SREC login page to gain access to an SREC role-specific set of menu pages and function pages which provide access to the relevant sections of the shared stroke information. It is these role-related sets of menu pages and function pages that control what part of the shared stroke information each person gets. In the case of members of the general public, there is no registration or login process involved, so people can enter by this method and gain access to a set of public access menu pages and function pages which provide access to carefully restricted sections of the shared stroke information. In the case of members of stroke support groups or stroke associations, anyone who has already entered the website of their own stroke organisation can gain access to a set of stroke organisation menu pages and function pages which provide access to relevant sections of the shared stroke information that are of particular interest to them. These stroke organisation menu pages and function pages would need to be added to existing websites, or special links could be added to existing pages to direct visitors to either of the other two access methods. It needs to be emphasised that this website design is very different from the conventional website design that has traditionally been used by business organisations. The main reason for this difference is that this design focuses very heavily on addressing the information needs of people, not the information needs of organisations. Well, that's about it for now. Thank you for your attention.